sağlıkçılar ve sevgili misafirlerimiz. Kusura bakmayın, kağıttan okuyorum, bugün çok heyecanlıyım. 2014 yılı Tıp Bayramı kutlamasına ve bilimsel sempozyumumuza hoş geldiniz. Bu kadar çok hekim ve sağlıkçıyı bir arada görmek çok güzel. Hepinizi yönetim kurulu arkadaşlarım adına çok teşekkür ediyorum ve saygıyla selamlıyorum. Bugün aramızda olan Avrupa Türk Sağlık Elemanları Federasyonları Başkanlarına da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Hepinize bilgi dolu iyi eğlenceler diliyorum. Saygı ve sevgilerimle. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kollegen und Gäste, ich möchte Sie für unsere Feier des Mediziner und Symposium herzlich willkommen heißen. Es macht uns so viele Ärzte, Gesundheitspersonal beieinander zu sehen, sehr freut mich. Wir danken Ihnen im Namen von unserem Vorstand herzlichst. Ich bin ein bisschen nervös, weil ich nicht jeden Tag so viele Kollegen vor mir sehe. Ich wünsche allen einen schönen Abend. Und şimdi sempozyumumuza Sayın Doktor Ercüment Erçin'le başlıyoruz. Kadınlarda kalp hastalıkları.
Mein Thema ist koronare Herzkrankheiten bei Frauen. Hier steht mein Name, das ist wohl sehr schwierig, und Gott sei Dank ist es sehr gut, das ist verstehen, also mein Ärztin. Wir arbeiten von 15 Jahren auf Baden, auf Kardiologie, im Bereich. Was sind koronare Herzkrankheiten? Unser Herz braucht Sauerstoff und Mineralien, die brauchen ihre eigenen Gefäße. Die Gefäße heißen Koronargefäße. Und koronare Herzkrankheit passiert, wenn diese Gefäße Verengungen oder Verstopfungen haben. Und das macht gerade eine Verstopfung, dann kommt Sauerstoffmangel in dem Herzmuskel. Der Herz hat drei Gefäße, drei Hauptgefäße. Wenn eine oder mehrere Verstopfungen haben, dann kommt Herzinfarkt. Und dieser Herzinfarkt macht Herzmuskelschaden. Dieser Film kennen wir viele. Im Bild. Das ist das wichtig. Die Herzgefäßkrankheiten sind die Nummer 1 von die Todesursachen von Frauen. Jede dritte Frau stirbt an einem Herzinfarkt. Die sind mehr als kumulativ von alle Krebs. Jede Minute ist eine Frau an einem Herzinfarkt. Ich höre viel, also wir haben eine Angst vor dem Krebs, das ist gut bei Frauen auch. Ich höre immer, Herr Doktor, das ist egal von meinem Herz, aber ich höre wahrscheinlich keine Mama kriegen, weil stimmt vielleicht auch, aber das ist jede 30. Frau stirbt an einem Mammakarzinom, oder jede dritte von einem Kopf. Herzgefäßerkrankung, Herzinfarkt. Deswegen muss man achten, wie ein Gynäkologe. Bei Frauen sind alles anders als Männer. Das wissen wir. Also auch beim Herzinfarkt auch. Erstens, wir lernen in der Schule, also im Studium und so, Herzinfarkt ist eine Männersache. Das ist doch eine Risikoberechnung in den Studenten auch. Das ist allein ein Mann zu sein, ist eine Risikofaktor für einen Herzinfarkt. Aber das ist bei Frauen auch wichtig. Und das bei Frauen sind Beschwerden auch anders. Normalerweise Herzinfarkt macht Druck auf der Brust, Schmerzen auf der Brust und die strahlt auf die linke Seite oder auf die. und dem Atemnot und Übelkeiten der Berechnung. Bei Frauen gibt es nur 50%, sogar weniger als das, diese Beschwerden. Und meistens anders. Die haben nicht ganz kleine Beschwerden, das ist ein bisschen Atemnot, Übelkeit, Müdigkeit, Rückenschmerzen und alles. Das macht also Verspätungen von der Diagnose nach Therapiearbeit. Deswegen müssen wir erst mit dem Personal das mehr achten. Das sind Risikofaktoren für erste Gefäßerkrankungen, die Familiengeschichte, Bluthochdruck, Cholesterol. Die sind wie Männer und Frauen das Gleiche. Aber die anderen drei, Rauchen, Diabetes und Obesität, sind mehr an Frauen. Kommt das hier noch? Welcher Film ist das? Das ist von Alfred Fischer. Bei Frauen sind 50% der Herzinfarkte im Rahmen des Rauchen. Die Frauen, die rauchen, haben 10 Jahre früher Herzinfarkt, als die nicht rauchen. Und die rauchen haben 4-6-fache mehr Herzinfarktrisiko. Das ist eine gute Methode zum Stoppen. Das ist auch andere. Frauen, die rauchen und dann noch Pille nehmen, die haben 30-fach höher Risiko für einen Herzinfarkt. Das müssen wir alle haben. Andere sind Diabetes. Diabetes sind bei Männern nur 2-3%, so 2- bis 3-fach. Erhöht die Herzinfarktrisiko, bei Frauen 3-7-fach. Das ist wie Harvey, der hat auch Diabetes. Frauen, die Herzinfarkt haben, mehr obes. Was muss man machen? Um das zu reduzieren. Bluthochdruck, Diabetes und Cholesterol. Unter Kontrolle haben wir von der ersten ein bisschen müssen auch das unter Kontrolle haben, helfen Patienten, das zu reduzieren. Wir müssen uns gut ernähren. Was muss man noch machen? Da muss man was mit 10% unserer Gewicht reduzieren. Und wenn wir das 2 Jahre lang behalten, das reduziert enorm die Herzinfarkt und dann Diabetes-Risiko. Und auch, wir sagen immer 5 Tage in der Woche, 30 bis 45 Minuten, mehr Akkus. Das heißt, dies macht die Risiko etwa 50% weniger. Wenn man machen kann, das gut, wenn man nicht. Dann machen wir mal laufen und so was. Aber sehen Sie, und natürlich müssen wir aufhören zu rauchen. Oder kann man auch weiterlaufen. Okay, das war kurz von meinem Vortrag. Ich bedanke mich an alle, unsere Sponsoren natürlich auch. Gibt es Fragen oder Kommentare? Dann ich würde jetzt Professor Wolfgang Korte hier einladen aus Kanton.
Also erst einmal vielen Dank für die Einladung. Ich bin wirklich freudig überrascht und habe das auch nicht gewusst, dass es in der Türkei ein Festival für Mediziner gibt. Könnten uns eine Scheibe davon abschneiden. But I was asked to switch to English since there are some international guests here. However, the slides are in German, so I can't provide Turkish slides. I'm sorry. So what I'd like to take you through is a theme that we learned each other on, and that is iron and iron deficiency. And what I'd like to take you through is look through the physiology, pathophysiology, what we do in order to determine iron deficiency, and how we could treat iron deficiency, or what is important to know about treatment. Now, if we look at the whole system that iron is circulated in, this is the whole body, you will see that most of the iron is present in the red cells in the body. So the red cells in the body are the biggest iron store that is available, although this is not usually recognized, because most of the time people think about the liver as the biggest store, and that is correct if you think about the stores that are in the visceral organs. However, in the fluids, the biggest store is within the red cells. And what we know is that we can take up 1 to 2 milligrams a day, and that we probably also lose 1 to 2 milligrams a day, usually. So this system is in an equilibrium. So we put in as much iron as we lose during a regular life cycle day. Now, we know that this is gender dependent, and if you look into into a regular day in a GP setting, you will see that a lot of the people that are diagnosed with iron are going to be young women. And why is that? Well, that's because of the menstruation, because with every single cycle of the menstruation, a woman loses up to 200 milligrams of iron. And that needs to be replaced. Depends a little bit on the amount of the blood loss during the her menstruation. Now, what is important about iron? If we talk about iron, we need to know that iron is essential for a lot of enzyme actions, and for the most important enzyme action, that is the transport of oxygen in hemoglobin. Iron has to be in a setting where it is double loaded, so it is dual positive. However, we know that iron ions can be triple positive, but before the iron can take up his duty and transport oxygen in hemoglobin, it has to be dual positive. And in addition to that, a lot of the iron that comes in with the food is triple positive. So we need something that changes the triple positive iron into double positive iron, and that is a reduction, and that's why we have a reductase in our gut, which transforms the triple positive into double positives. That now allows the iron to be resorbed into the enterocyte, so the cell that sits in the gut, and afterwards it is transported again into the circulation, where it has to be switched again, because as we already know now, the iron can only take up its enzymatic action or its coenzymatic action if it's triple positive. So once we have a reductase, and then we have an oxidase, which is called hepastin, on the aboral side, so the downside of the cell with regard to the gut. And then there is a protein which we will recognize again later on during the presentation, ferroportin, which is regulated by hepcidin. And I don't want to go into more details here, but I think this is something that we have learned over the last 10 to 15 years, which has largely increased our understanding of the iron regulation. Now, it's important to know that we have to switch the positivity in order to get the iron into the body, into the enterocyte. And then there is another protein that is important, and that is ferritin. Why is ferritin important? the so-called apoferritin, which is the protein without the iron ions, is important because it stores iron. And it's not only important because it stores iron, but iron itself as a free ion would be toxic. So we need something that at one side would store the iron, and on the other side will make sure that those irons that we need for our enzymatic action in every single cell of our body is non-toxic. So every single cell of the body essentially has some ferritin because it needs a way to first store the iron and then make it non-toxic. Now, this is the amount of iron that we take in every day, and this is the amount of iron that can be resorbed. So there is already a large difference between those parts. And as you can see here, even less is then resorbed into the enterocyte, into this cell, and even less than this will come to the circulation. So even less than this will end up in the circulation where the iron then can be transported to the cells that are in need of iron. Now, how do these cells get their iron? Well, this is something that was also recognized over the last 10 to 15 years. And we knew already earlier on that there is a protein called transferrin in the blood, which essentially transports iron from the gut circulation to the cell in the body. And this transferrin is the protein that brings the iron ions onto the so-called transferrin receptor. So if there is transferrin and that needs to go into the cell, then the cell needs a receptor for that. And it does that by simply including the whole part of the membrane with the iron loaded on the transferrin into the cell, make it a vesicle, and acidify it. And if it's acidified, then this will release the iron from the transferrin, and the rest can be recycled to the cell surface again. Now, if you have a receptor up here that is linked in the membrane, but where the membrane is mobile, then one can imagine that this receptor can also be loosened from the membrane. And this is what we can nowadays use in clinical diagnostics, because we can measure the amount of receptors that are loosened from the cell surface, which we call the soluble transferrin receptor, STFR. Now, why is this helpful? It's helpful because the soluble parts, the loosened part from the surface, is in equilibrium with the amount of total transferrin receptors on the cell surface everywhere in the body. And why is that important? The more iron the cell needs, the more receptors it will put up onto the surface. And the more receptors are up on the surface, the more of those receptors will be loosened and then can be measured in the circulation. So the soluble transferrin receptor, under most circumstances, and I point to that, under most circumstances, is a reliable mirror of the need of the cell of iron. There are some situations, however, where that needs to be cautioned, and that is when there are a lot of cells that are depending on iron. Then your soluble transferrin receptor concentration will not only be dependent on the amount of the iron that the cell needs, but it will be also dependent on the number of cells that are out there. And you can see that very easily in patients with chronic leukemias, for example. In chronic leukemia patients where there are a lot of cells circulating, you will always have a high concentration of soluble transferrin receptor, not only because the cells need iron, but because there are so many cells present, and they all get rid of their, or partially rid of their transferrin receptor on the surface. Now, what are the reasons to be iron deficient? And from my perspective, there are really only, with a little bit of this fraction, there are only two reasons. Either you don't put enough in here into the system, or you lose too much. These are the two reasons that you can have in order to be iron deficient. So the question again comes up, as in real life always, is the glass half full or is it half empty? So what is then the important part? The important part is that the ferritin gives us a very good correlation of the total iron load that we have, because we have a constant load of approximately 2,500 irons of iron per molecule of ferritin. So there is a constant load that is represented by the ferritin. So we really can rely on the ferritin in most of the circumstances as a good mirror of the total iron load. However, the ferritin is an acute phase protein, which means if you have an inflammation going on, your protein will go up, independent of whether there is more iron in the body or not. And those of you who have experienced the introduction of ferritin into clinical practice might remember that in very early days, ferritin was not really used as the indicator of iron load, but it was used as a total, so-called total cancer marker. So it was used as a tumor marker because we know that, as in many other inflammatory diseases, there are some isoferritins, so some certain ferritin forms that are increased if malignant tumors are present. So it's important to realize that in the chronic phase with the chronic inflammation as well as with acute inflammation, that there can be ferritin increases even if your iron load does not go